Hello and welcome everyone to this session. Today's topic is year-end closing best practices for SAP Asset Accounting. My name is Thomas Michael, and for those of you who don't know me, I've been in the SAP world for over 20 years. I'm the CEO of the Michael Management Corporation. I speak a lot and I write a lot about SAP topics. And if you ever want to reach me, here's my real email address, tmichael@michaelmanagement.com. I always gladly share my 2 cents with anything that you might want to ask me. In my career as an SAP consultant, I've always focused on asset accounting topics. And one of the biggest cause for problems was always the year-end closing. So that's why I put this session together. I'm not going to actually go through the year-end closing steps with you. I'll share the best practices for year-end closing first. I'll give you a quick overview why the year-end closing process is important. We all know that it is important, but do we really know why or what could happen if we don't pay attention to it? So I'll share that. And then I'll go through the best practices for the closing process. And most importantly, I'll share the number one mistake with you that people make when it comes to closing the year. So if you don't take anything else away from this session, just that number one mistake is something for you to remember. And then last but certainly not least, I'll give you a special link for our detailed step-by-step year-end closing guide at the end. So let's hop right to it. Year-end closing, obviously it's part of the overall closing process for the entire company. Every module has their own closing steps and closing processes. And for us in asset accounting, we have that too. And we're just one little piece in the entire year-end closing process. The steps that I refer to in this outline or in this session are for the most common steps necessary. So they apply to most companies out there. But if you dig into the details of your own company and the functionality you guys use, your closing steps might be different. You might have additional steps. You might have fewer steps. So keep that in mind when we talk about this, right? So this is a generic outline. Your own company's version of it will always be different. So what happens if you decide to skip the year-end closing, or maybe you close the year, but it's done incorrectly or improperly? Here are the top 4 errors that can or most likely will occur when the year is not closed properly. First thing is reconciliation problems. So that means your asset accounting subledger doesn't reconcile, doesn't match the general ledger. So it's a big problem, right? So if you have one number in the subledger but a totally different number in the general ledger, that's an issue. These two ledgers need to match to the penny at year end. And of course, if you're a publicly traded company, that's a SOX non-compliance issue, right? So if your ledgers are out of sync, that's considered a non-compliance issue. That's a big issue, and your chief compliance officer obviously doesn't want to see this. Also, what happens is you can cause recalculation differences. So if you don't close the year at all in asset accounting or do it improperly, but you open up the next year, so that means you have now 2 open fiscal years in asset accounting, whereas in the general ledger you don't. You only have 1 open fiscal year, of course. So every time you touch an asset master record, for example, and you make changes to it, let's say you change something as innocent as the description of an asset master record. If you click save and the system saves that asset master record, it will automatically perform a recalculation of the asset's values for all open fiscal years. That's not something that you do or you have control over. It just happens. You click save, the system will recalc the asset's values. But now, of course, it recalculates it for all open fiscal years. So if you didn't close last year, you still have 2 open fiscal years. So now suddenly the system might tell you, hey, I just recalculated depreciation for last year. Let's post this to the general ledger. But of course you can't, because the general ledger for last year is closed. So that's a big issue, a big problem. And what I see a lot is that people run into these problems and then they try to fix them or skip over them or try to do some voodoo, and then things just get worse. And that can lead to data inconsistencies or even data loss. I've had several clients over the years that I worked with where it ended up in data loss. So the planned depreciation amounts that are stored in the system were gone. They were all zero. It was all blank for all of their assets for that open fiscal year. So that was a big, big problem, and it took a long time to painstakingly restore these values. All right, so all these problems can be fixed, but it takes a long time, costs a lot of money, and is something that's easily avoidable if you just follow the right year-end closing process. Here's an interesting thing that people don't realize. The year-end close is an optional step in the system. There's nothing in the system that forces you to close this fiscal year, right? So we're at the end of 2017. Nothing in the system says you must close this fiscal year. You can absolutely skip this. It's a bad idea, but theoretically, you can skip it. The only problem then is at the end of next year. So when at the end of 2018 and you're trying to open up 2019, you will get an error message. Looks like this, right? So we're at the end of 2017 now. If we decide to skip the closing of 2017 going into 2018, that the system allows us to do that. But then when we're at the end of 2018 and we're trying to open up 2019, we'll get a hard error message, and the system says you can't do that because you already have 2 open fiscal years, and that's the max that's allowed. So you now have to do 2 year-end closings back to back. That's obviously a terrible situation to be in, especially when it's at the end of the year and you need to do things quickly. You don't have a whole lot of time because the other teams won't wait for you. Right? So keep that in mind. While it's possible to skip a year and close, it's absolutely a bad idea to do that because you just create more problems later on. Now let's talk about best practices. So first thing is prepare and plan. If you don't have that already, you should absolutely work on this. You should have a formal step-by-step document that details out all the individual steps necessary for a year-end close. A lot of people think, well, year-end close for asset accounting, it's 2 steps, right? You need to open up the new fiscal year and close the old fiscal year. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's actually a lengthy process of at least a dozen, maybe more steps that need to be performed in the right sequence, in the right order, by the right people, with the right dependencies. So this document that you need to create must be detailed enough that anybody can pick it up and close the year with it. And I'll tell you a story why that's so important. A few years ago, I received a phone call from one of our clients on January 2nd on my cell phone, and they said, Tom, oh my God, you need to come in. We have a big problem. Nothing works in asset accounting. We can't create assets. We can't change assets. We can't post to them. We can't run reports. Literally nothing works. So I logged into the system. I took a look and I noticed that, hey, you guys haven't done anything for closing the year or opening up the new year. And turns out that there's a lady at that company that always has done it every year, and she knew exactly what to do, and they never had any issues with year-end closing in the past. It just happened that that year, that lady was on extended medical leave. She was out. So, and there was no plan in place. Nobody knew what she was actually doing year in, year out. So nothing got done. So that's a terrible situation to be in, obviously, and that can easily be avoided by having this formal plan in place. What should be in that document? First thing is you should have a detailed timeline that spells out exactly when each step needs to be performed. And then, of course, you need explanations how to perform this step and be really detailed here. Don't just say, oh, you need to run the year-end close transaction or open fiscal year transaction. You should have it so detailed that you put screenshots in there, and for every field, you say exactly what needs to be put into that field, what button needs to be clicked on. So again, the point is that anybody should be able to pick up this document and close the year with it. Also, you should spell out who the required resources are, who is actually performing this step, who's responsible for it. And you might go as detailed as, naming names, right? So Bob, you need to perform this step on December 15th, and here's how you do it. Or you might identify a resource, a department, or a team member, a team, as opposed to a specific person. Either way, you need to say who needs to perform this step. And then lastly, but certainly not least, you need to specify, is this step dependent on anything else, right? Do I need to coordinate this step with someone? For example, one of the steps in your year-end close process will be to run depreciation for the very last period, for the last time in the year, right? Depreciation for period 12. Well, you don't want to run this unless a successful settlement of your capital investment measures, your internal orders and your WBS elements, has been performed, right? So depreciation for period 12 is dependent on the successful completion of another step. So keep that in mind. That needs to be in the document. And yeah, good comment here. Nobody ever does these steps. Very true. And that's exactly the reason why we're having this session, right? It is the year-end close in asset accounting is one of the biggest causes for problems. All right, next best practice, say that 3 times in a row, is start early. I see that a lot where companies say, well, it's a year-end close process, so we do it at year-end. That's a terrible idea. It's absolutely not, because our year-end close process involves a lot of steps, at least a dozen, if not more. So it's a very lengthy process. So you need to start this process right now. In fact, if you haven't started this process as of today, today's December 6th, happy St. Nicholas, everyone. If you haven't started your process now, you're behind already. You're already too late. Well, you're not too late, but you're late to the party, all right? So the year-end close process starts as soon as period 11 has been closed, which I assume for most of you folks is just about now. And yeah, good comment here. You're a senior SAP specialist and you never received a list from the accounting department. Exactly, because they don't really know asset accounting all that well, and they're the folks that think, well, can't be any harder than all the other modules, right? But it is. It's a lot harder in asset accounting, and it involves a lot more steps. So that's why it's important that we in asset accounting develop this plan. So your year-end close process should start right now. As soon as period 11 has been closed, and a lot of the steps that we need to perform for year-end closing, you can run in test mode. That's a very important feature because the test mode will list problems, any kind of errors, issues with assets, issues with depreciation posting or calculation of depreciation values. They will be listed in the logs of the test mode runs. So that's why it's important to run these steps now and identify all these errors, analyze them, and fix them, because now we have the time, right? We have an entire month to fix any issues that we find. So it's not a big deal if we find an asset with recalculation problems or some missing configuration or the calendar wasn't updated, right? Or maybe there's a reconciliation issue. We can fix these things now. We have an entire month. If you wait to run these jobs till the very end of the year and then you see errors, well, now you have a problem because you don't have the time to analyze them or fix them, right? So very important. Start now and run all these jobs in test mode. And keep in mind that the typical close process for asset accounting takes anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. All right, so if you start right now, it'll run through probably the end of the first week of the new year. So that takes you out to about 5 weeks when you actually close the year. So it's over a month of work to close the year. Third best practice is collaborate. So SAP is an integrated system. It's connected to all of the other modules. All of these things talk to each other, so you need to do that too. You're not closing the year in a vacuum. You need to coordinate with the other teams. So for example, I mentioned this issue where you can't close the asset accounting subledger unless the final settlement run for period 12 has been performed, and not just performed, but performed successfully, and it is in fact the final run. All right. So you're dependent on the activities that happen in other teams. What you want to do is line up all of your closing activities, right? Write them all out. And again, it'll be a dozen, if not more, steps. Line them up in a calendar and really define what step needs to happen on what day. And then meet with the other functional teams and also the technical team and have them take a look at this to see, does it make sense for you to plan this step on that day? Because they might have a different step planned for the same day or a day later, and it might be dependent on your step. So you really need to make sure that you line up all the closing steps in a logical sequence. The teams that you want to coordinate with are, of course, the financial accounting team, general ledger, all right? But also, if you buy assets from vendors directly, you might need to coordinate with the AP team, accounts payable, if they have to pay invoices to vendors for assets directly. You need to coordinate with a controlling team for two reasons. Most likely you post depreciation to a controlling object, could be a cost center for most of you guys. Maybe for some you post it to an internal order. So that needs to be coordinated. And also you might have capital investment orders, internal orders that are capital in nature that need to be settled to asset accounting. So you need to coordinate the settlement steps. Same thing if you use project systems for capital WBS elements, you need to coordinate with the PS team. If you manage your capital investment measures through the IM module, the investment management module, same thing, you want to make sure you pull those folks in. And then finally, don't forget the technical team, the basis team, because they might have, or they will have, technical jobs planned for the system, backups, restores, patches, all those things. Also, they will lock the system for any kind of config changes at a certain point in time. So you need to be aware of these steps. Here's another question. Where's the team? Again, if there are any things that directly impact asset accounting from other teams, could be MM2, could also be PM, right? The plant maintenance team, if you link your asset master records to equipment records. So this is just, these are the teams that you most likely need to coordinate with, but this is not the complete list. There could be other teams, other departments or modules you need to coordinate with too, okay? One story that I want to tell, we had a client a few years ago, a very big company. They had 1 million asset master records, 1 million. That's a lot of assets. And every year they performed a depreciation forecast for 5 years out. So that's 1 million master records times 5 years. That's 5 million depreciation values that needed to be calculated and carried forward. So when you run the depreciation forecast report for those guys, it literally runs an entire day, right? Because they're not on S4HANA, they're still on ECC6, so that job runs for over a day. So that's okay as long as you coordinate that with the basis team and let them know that, hey, next Saturday, we need the system to be up and running because we want to perform this depreciation forecast. So those are some of the things you want to coordinate with the tech team too. All right, so those are the main best practices when it comes to closing a year. Now, the most important thing for you to take home, the number one mistake that people make when it comes to closing the year. Out of all the errors and calls and issues that I see in systems, 8 out of 10 times, I can trace it back to that one error right here. And who wants to venture a guess? Type it in your little chat box or your question box. What do you think is the number one mistake that people make when it comes to closing the year? No. Actually, you had a question about HANA makes a difference for performance. That's a whole nother question. So in general, yes, S/4HANA cuts reporting time down to, less than a tenth. Some people say a thousandth of the old reporting performance. But honestly, that's not all implemented yet. So a lot of these things are not reality just yet. So we have clients that are in S/4HANA and they still have the same performance issues. But again, that's a whole nother topic that we can discuss. But yeah, does anyone have any guesses as far as what's the number one mistake people make? And it's an easy one to avoid, actually. I don't see anything that hits the nail on the head just yet, so I'm just going to say it. Number one mistake is not closing the asset accounting subledger before the general ledger. So just by definition, the subledger feeds values into the general ledger. So as a result, it's just logical that the subledger must be closed before the general ledger. And if that doesn't happen, remember those four errors that are listed earlier? That's what can happen. All right. So this is an easy one to avoid. All right. If you don't do this, all right, you close the general ledger, subledger is still open, and then for example, you do a recalculation of values, or you just update one asset master record. Now suddenly, your subledger wants to post an adjustment to the general ledger, and even if it's just a penny, but it can't because GL is already closed now. So that's a giant problem. And what I see a lot is that people then say, that's a problem. Yeah, we'll fix it later. All right, we'll close, the year's closed, we'll move forward, we'll roll into the new year, and then next year when we have a little time, we'll fix this. Well, now you made a small problem a really big problem. All right, so you don't want to be in that situation. So always insist that the subledger gets closed first before small errors become really big errors. Now, how do you do that? Well, identify the person in your company, in your accounting team, that actually closes the accounting periods in the FI module, right? Who does that transaction? And then when you find that person, have a conversation with that person and say, hey, what day do you plan to close the period? And then make sure that you close the fiscal year and asset accounting prior to that, and make sure that the person understands that, if you can't close the year in asset accounting, they can't close the year for the entire company. It's a big, big problem, but that's the process that needs to be followed. And remember, that's something that you need to manage. SAP does not manage this for you. They will not prevent you from closing the year in GL first. There's no error message. There's no warning message. None of that. It's you that needs to manage this process. So that kind of covers the best practices for year-end closing. We're 3-4 minutes left here. I want to share with you our year-end closing guide. So if you don't have this guide that I was talking about, right, the step-by-step process that details those 12, 13, maybe 15 steps you need to close the year, we have this guide. And we've had this for a while. We've always had it for ECC 6, and we just released it for S/4HANA 2 now. So all the steps are updated for S/4HANA and also for ECC. And because it's St. Nicholas, everybody gets a present. We'll offer this for 50% off until the end of the year. Here's a coupon code, half off, and here's a link to that year-end closing guide. And you don't need to write it down. We'll send you an email with the link and that coupon code this afternoon, and you can take a look. And this will actually detail the steps and will help you create your own closing document. All right, so with that, let's just quickly summarize what we went through. So first, let's understand, or let's be aware that the year-end closing for asset accounting requires many, many steps. It's not just, open the year and close the year, but it's a dozen steps. And the year-end closing process starts right now. At the beginning of period 12, you need to run through these steps. Most importantly, make sure asset accounting gets closed before the general ledger. No matter what happens, always make sure subledger gets closed first. And if you do see any asset errors on your test runs or the final runs, the update runs, don't skip them, right? You need to fix these errors before they become major issues. If you see an error now it's easy to fix. You can address it now. You have the time to do that. If you wait until next year, it becomes very costly, very labor intensive. And of course, have a company specific step-by-step plan. Don't just take our generic year-end closing guide and think that's the perfect guide for you. No, you need to create a company specific version of this. All right. So yeah, if you want to email me later, by all means, don't be shy. Send me any questions. I'll always love to answer it. Also, if you have any questions now, type it into your chat box. We have about 2 minutes left. I hope this session was valuable. Thank you, Atri, for being part of this. Much appreciated. I hope this was useful, and I don't see any go up. I do see a question here. Nope, just, yeah, thank you. You're very welcome. Great. So again, have a happy holiday season, and thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you at one of my next webinars. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.